tasted fire, I'm ready to come alive. I can't just shut it up and fake that I'm alright. I'm ready now, I'm not waiting for the afterlife.
There is no middle ground. There is no neutrality with God. You cannot ride the fence with God. There's only a yellow stripe in the middle of the road for cowards who want to say, I serve God, and try to stay and serve the world at the same time. You can't serve both. That yellow stripe is for cowards. Get out of the middle of the road and choose this day whom you will serve. Choose this day whom you will serve. Will you serve the Almighty God?
Welcome to the Last Frontier Evangelism Radio with your host, Pastor Dave Grisham, where we take Jesus to the streets and liberals to the woodshed on Hot Talk, KOAN, 95.1 FM and 1080 AM. Now, here's your host, Pastor Dave.
Good morning, Alaska. This is Pastor Dave Grisham back on Last Frontier Evangelism Radio. Good to have you back this week. Now, last week I closed out by telling you that we were going to talk about atheism this week, and there is a very good reason I want to talk about atheism. We have run into numerous atheists around the country when we're preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ on the streets. We run into them at bars, nightclubs. We run into them at colleges and universities. And I've preached at Harvard, MIT, Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., as well as preached at universities here in Alaska and Texas. And I run into atheists all the time. I have some really good conversations with them. And there's a very good reason why, is because I used to be an atheist. That's right. When I was in college, I attended West Texas State University, which is now called West Texas A&M, and I was an atheist when I was in college. Now, what is atheism exactly? Atheism is a denial of a deity. It's a denial of God, the existence of God, and agnosticism is saying you doubt or you don't know if there is a God. And I used to call myself an agnostic, but I used to deny God, so basically I was an atheist. And I got my life changed by Jesus Christ. Now, a lot of people who call themselves atheists, they don't really believe in God, and yet oftentimes God will actually speak to them. I spoke to an atheist just the other day when I was out preaching on the streets here in Anchorage, and he told me he had a life after death experience. He actually had an experience where he died when he was donating blood, and he momentarily died and went to heaven. And I told him, I said, God is trying to tell you something, sir. He's trying to tell you that heaven is real and God is real. Now, Lee Strobel, who was a very famous author, and he was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He's the, in case you don't remember your history, Lee Strobel is the gentleman who broke the Watergate story, which ended up getting Richard Nixon to resign from office. He was the one who interviewed Deep Throat and broke the entire story. And he was an avowed atheist for most of his life. And he started out to write a book, The Case Against Christ, but when he studied the evidence, he actually gave his life to Christ and made the title of the book, The Case for Christ. And he's since written a lot of other books, The Case for God, The Case for Easter, The Case for Christmas. He's written a lot of other books, and now he is a prominent Christian author. Now, Lee Strobel had an experience like I just described to you. He had an experience that was a miracle when he was an atheist. He had a 5-month-old son who got very, very sick. And he brought him a 5-week-old son, not 5 months. He was 5 weeks old. Brought him into the hospital, and he coded a couple of times. They actually had to restart his heart, I think twice. And Lee Strobel was, of course, totally distraught, afraid he was going to lose his son. And he actually, at one point in the waiting room, dropped on his knees and cried out to God. And he said, God, if you're real, if you are truly there, please, please save my son. And guess what? Within an hour, his son was completely healed. And the doctors were stunned. They had no idea what had made him sick, and they had no idea why he suddenly recovered. But Lee Strobel cried out to God, and God healed his son, and his son went home the next day totally normal. Now, at the time, he blew that off as though it was nothing important. And the reason I'm telling you this is because you may be an atheist out there and you've had some sort of an experience that you cannot explain. And you're going to be hard-pressed to explain it with science. How are you going to explain something like Lee Strobel went through with science? Or what I'm about to tell you happened to me as an atheist? I had something happen to me as an atheist that was a miracle. It happened back in the early 80s when I was attending college, and my best friend had come over to my apartment, and we were sitting in the living room, and we were having a discussion about where we were going to go eat for lunch. And in the course of that discussion, I had the strongest deja vu. That's what I called it at the time, because at the time I wasn't a Christian, so I wouldn't have referred to it as prophetic, but it was prophetic. And I said, whoa, wait a second, Danny, who was the name of my best friend. I said, I just had the strongest deja vu I've ever had in my life. And he said, really, what was it? And I said, well, I suddenly remembered a dream. What you said a moment ago was the exact phrase that you had spoken in a dream that I had a couple of nights before. And now I remember the dream. And I said, and we were having this exact same conversation in this exact place at this exact time, and you spoke those exact words. And I said, but it goes farther. I remember ahead in the dream that about 5 minutes from this point, about 5 minutes from now, a police officer is going to come to the door of my apartment and knock on my door, but he's going to be looking for someone else. And my friend Danny said, well, that'd be kind of freaky if that really happened. And I said, yeah, it would. So we continued our conversation, decided where we were going to go eat lunch, and we walked out the front door of my apartment, went down the stairs to the car, and were about to get in the car when, lo and behold, a deputy sheriff's car pulls right up next to us. And this deputy sheriff gets out of his car, walks up to my apartment, knocks on the door, and I said, excuse me, officer, can I help you? And he said, he waved a piece of paper in his hand, a warrant. And he says, I have a warrant for so-and-so's arrest, and he lives in these apartments, and he's a college student, and I know that this apartment complex is full of college students, so I just kind of picked your door at random to knock on it to maybe see if you would know who this guy was. And I said, no, officer, I don't know him. All I know is the people next door. I haven't lived here very long. He said, okay, thank you, and he got in his car and left. And my friend Danny and I were standing there with our mouths hanging open. How in the world could I have such a dream if God does not exist? How in the world could that happen? I had a prophetic dream. I was able to predict what was going to happen 5 minutes into the future, and I was an atheist, and I didn't believe in God. I should have just knocked myself right in the head, because obviously there is a God in heaven who does know the future. How else am I going to know that a police officer who you rarely interact with is going to come to my door out of all the dozens of doors and knock on my door looking for someone else? It was just too incredible to be coincidental. So I got a couple of quotes here from some former atheists I want to read to you. I actually want to just read basically one. It's from Peter Hitchens, The Rage Against God, How Atheism Led Me to Faith, from his book. He says, the current intellectual assault on God in Europe and North America is in fact a specific attack on Christianity, the faith that stubbornly persists in the morality, laws, and government of the major Western countries. The God they fight is the Christian God, because he is their own God. God is the leftists' chief rival. Christian belief, by subjecting all men to divine authority and by asserting in the words, my kingdom is not of this world, that the ideal society does not exist in this life, is the most coherent and potent obstacle to secular utopianism. The Bible angers and frustrates those who believe that the pursuit of a perfect society justifies the quest for absolute power. And then he also said, when it comes to the millions of small and tedious good deeds that are needed for a society to function with charity, honesty, and kindness, a shortage of believing Christians will lead to that society's decay. I totally agree with that. And we're going to talk about the dangers of atheism and how it relates to socialism right after the break. This is Pastor Dave Grisham, Last Frontier Evangelism. You can reach me at lastfrontierevangelism@gmail.com. Be back right after the break. Don't go away. Good morning, Alaska. Welcome back from the break. This is Pastor Dave with Last Frontier Evangelism Radio on 95.1 FM, 1080 AM, KOAN Radio, Hot Talk Radio. And we are talking today about atheism. And the reason we're talking about atheism is because atheism is probably the single greatest danger to your religious freedoms in America today. Let me quote a little bit of this article right here, Adams on the Dangers of Atheism, as written by Dr. Joel McDermott. Now, this was a quote from John Adams, our second president of the United States, and he says, "Is there a possibility that the government of nations may fall into the hands of men who teach the most disconsolate of all creeds, that men are but fireflies, and that this is all without a father? Is this the way to make man as man an object of respect, or is it to make murder itself as indifferent as shooting a plover and the extermination of the Rohilla nation as innocent as the swallowing of mites on a morsel of cheese?" Atheists today, the article goes on, says, atheists today argue that religion is the root of all evil and that science and reason dissipate the delusions that drive men to acts of terror. Our founder, however, argues that science and reason, when they train their scopes upon human nature, tell us exactly the opposite. The greatest cause for concern derives, Adam argues, from human nature. He asks rhetorically, has the progress of science, arts, and letters yet discovered that there are no passions in human nature, no ambition, avarice, or a desire of fame? Are these passions cooled, diminished, or extinguished? Have these propensities less a tendency to divisions, controversies, seditions, mutinies, and civil wars than formerly? Adams understood what our atheist critics fail to, that the advancement of learning itself cannot change the hearts of men. And that's exactly what I would tell you, that atheism offers no solutions to the problems of human nature. And that is the danger. That is the problem. You see, atheism does not change human nature. It has no ability to. In fact, what it does, it simply gives credibility or permission for your basically flawed human nature to run amok in society. That's what it does. It provides a lack of accountability for your unruly or chaotic or ungodly behavior. That's really all it is. It's simply an excuse system to turn you off of God so that your basic human nature, which is to sin, which is to commit acts of selfishness in the flesh, to run rampant and run wild. That is exactly what it is. And atheism's greatest political danger, now I'm going to combine politics and religion again because we'll do that on this show. I'm not afraid of that. I'm telling you right now that the greatest danger politically to atheism is called socialism. Socialism is the politics of atheism. That's exactly what it is. Socialism is the politics of atheism. Separation of church and state. What is so dangerous about that? Well, first of all, let's talk about the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers did not have the same idea as socialists or atheists do today about the separation of church and state. They didn't have the same ideas. I can prove it because the first act of Congress as a new nation was to pass a spending bill. Now, that's not surprising. Congress is always spending money. But they did one very important thing. They spent $25,000 on Bibles as the first and absolute act of Congress. Put that in your separation of church and state pipe and smoke it, folks. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. They not only spent the money on Bibles, but guess what they were for? To put them in public schools. Oh my gosh, the blasphemy. Yes, they were going to take those Bibles and put them in public schools. And you see, that's the danger of socialism combined with atheism today. That's why they're trying to remove God from the public square. You see, here's the thing. The way they've defined or redefined separation of church and state basically is that if it has anything to do with the state, religion cannot be involved. Well, if you believe that, then what happens with socialism is socialism basically runs everything by the state. Communism, socialism, it basically takes over everything in the public sphere for the quote-unquote common good, and the state runs everything. Like, for instance, if Obamacare ended up leading to a single-payer system and the government overtook all of the hospitals and clinics and doctors' offices and everything, just like they do over in Canada or they do over in the UK, then basically the government would run the healthcare system. Well, what does that do when you have separation of church and state? Well, it pushes the chaplains right out of the hospitals. It pushes you praying for people who are sick right out of the hospitals because you can't mix church and state. But when the state runs everything, folks, it takes over everything and pushes God out of everything. You see where I'm going with this? You see, think of it like this. Environmentalists will often tell you that the greatest danger to species in North America is loss of habitat. Well, I'm going to tell you the greatest threat to your religious freedoms in America is loss of habitat. You see, creeping socialism and atheism in America is sort of like the urban sprawl. It's pushing it's destroying the religious environment in America, and the loss of religious habitat is the greatest threat to your religious freedoms today. That's exactly what socialism does. It is pushing Christianity out of the public square, and what they want you to do eventually is only worship God in your church. That's why when Hillary Clinton, she said the same thing that Barack Obama always says, and this is the mark of a socialist. When you hear someone say these words, you know they're a socialist. They said freedom of worship. Folks, we don't have freedom of worship in America. We have freedom of religion and the free exercise thereof. You see, when they just have freedom of worship, that's exactly what the communists and the socialists say. You can go into your church and worship God any way you want, but then when you get outside of that, well, that all belongs to the government, and there's no place for God in any of that. That is a recipe, folks, for disaster. Why do I say that? Well, because what I just said about a minute ago about atoms, the human nature is not changed by atheism. It actually just makes an excuse for human nature to run amok. So what happens? You get a socialist nation that crowds God out of the public sphere, right? And then people start using that as an excuse because there's no accountability to anything higher than mankind. And you start making all these laws, and you can smoke dope, and you can get drunk, and you can have sex with men, can have sex with men. And next thing you know, men are marrying young girls and all kinds of other horrible things. They make excuses for it. And then what happens in human nature? Society starts to break down. It starts to break down because law and order is now replaced with chaos and confusion, anarchy. Well, then what is the government's response? They clamp down. They basically come down on you like a hammer. Socialism and atheism are a recipe for tyranny. They are a recipe for political tyranny. If you accept socialism in America today, if you accept that, and along with it goes atheism, if you accept that, you are accepting tyranny and the possibility of genocide. Because look at what the Nazis did. The word Nazi is a German acronym for National Socialist German Workers' Party. And they committed atrocities. They committed genocide. Look at the former Soviet Union, Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. They committed genocide. Look at the North Korean, the Socialist People's Republic of Korea. Guess what? They put people in camps. They commit genocide. Communists in Cuba committed genocide. Socialism is a recipe for lawlessness and disorder, and it is a recipe for genocide. If you don't want these things to take place, you have to turn your nation back to God. You have to turn your nation back to God. George Washington said that a constitutional republic with our Constitution is only suitable for a moral and religious people, because anything other than that, they will abuse their freedoms and it will lead to tyranny. And that's what I'm telling you, folks. All right, this is Pastor Dave Grisham, Last Frontier Evangelism Radio. I hear the music playing, so we got a break coming up. You can contact me at lastfrontierevangelism@gmail.com or look us up on YouTube and Facebook under Last Frontier Evangelism. Hold on, folks. We'll be right back after this break. Good morning, Alaska. Welcome back from the break. This is Pastor Dave Grisham with Last Frontier Evangelism Radio right here on KOAN 95.1 FM, 1080 AM Hot Talk Radio. And we are back from the break talking about atheism and the dangers of atheism. Atheists should be afraid of God. They really should. They should be afraid of God. The Bible says it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. An atheist should be as terrified as a gerbil in a gay bar. They should be terrified of an all-knowing, all-judging, righteous, and holy God. And they will believe in God someday when they stand in front of him. But there is I've noticed a large number of atheists here in Alaska. I've run into quite a few of them out on the street. So I thought I'd give you some tips today on how to witness to an atheist if you meet one. If you're talking to an atheist as a Christian, don't talk to the atheist about science and all these other things, because that's generally their strong point, and they've got all these prearranged arguments, and unless you've got a college degree or something, you may not want to go down that road. But it doesn't really matter anyway, because it's not difficult to prove the existence of God. It's difficult to prove to get people to believe that there is a God. That's the difficult part. But there are some techniques that you can use. The weakness of atheism is morality. As we talked about in the previous segment, atheism does not offer any solution to the depravity of the nature of man. Doesn't offer any solutions. As a matter of fact, it just offers an excuse which exacerbates the problem rather than gives any solutions. So if you talk to an atheist, talk to him about morality. And ask them this. Ask them if they believe in moral absolutes. Now, I love to do this particular technique on college campuses. When you're talking to an atheist, maybe it's a guy and there's a lot of women around, and you ask him this question: do you believe in absolute truth? And they'll always say, no, I believe what's true for me is not necessarily true for you. They believe in relative truth, because if they believe in absolute moral truth that transcends mankind, now they're in the territory of God. So they can't really admit to that. So they're not going to argue that there is absolute moral truths, because then you're going to ask them where that came from, and they're going to have a hard time explaining it. So what you do is ask them if they believe in absolute truth. They're going to say no. Then ask them this question: is rape always wrong? Now, they're usually going to say, what? And you're going to have to repeat the question because they can't believe you actually asked it. Say, is rape always wrong? Now, as a Christian, I believe rape is always wrong, of course, because I believe in absolute moral truth. Now, the atheist is going to have a really difficult time, and he's going to squirm and hem and haw, and he's probably going to try to, dodge the question. He's going to say, well, in some cultures they believe. No, I don't care what some cultures believe. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, is rape always wrong, period, regardless of what people choose to believe? And if he says yes, then he's admitted to an absolute moral truth, and now he's back to God's territory, and he's having to explain how he can come up with an absolute moral truth absent from God. And then if he says no, if he says that no, rape is not always wrong, well, now he's a barbarian, and he's just destroyed all of his credibility with anyone who's listening, especially women. And you can look around and say, look, you better be careful how you answer this question, buddy, because you may not ever get another date at this college campus if you say rape is okay under certain circumstances. Rape is always wrong. That is an absolute moral truth. You see, now, basically what you're trying to get across to the atheist is that they have to derive all of their morality from mankind, because they don't believe in an authority above man. So essentially, if they're going to get their morality from man, then they're going to have to agree with the majority of what people believe. Because if they don't, they're going to say, well, I don't believe that, I don't agree with that, then they're going to have a hard time explaining what their moral position is and how they came to that moral conclusion. Because now they're arguing basically in a position that's above mankind. Because if your morality comes from man, you're kind of stuck with that. It's hard to elevate yourself above what men believe in terms of the majority. For instance, here's another technique. Ask them if they lived 150 to 200 years ago when slavery was legal and they ran across an escaped slave. Now, the law said that an escaped slave had to be returned to his master. If you, as an atheist, living during that time, had run across an escaped slave, would you obey the law and return him to his master, or would you help him go free? Now, again, they're stuck in a moral quandary here, because if they say, well, I would help him go free, you're going to say, well, what's the basis of your morality for that? Because in those days, the majority of people believed that slavery was moral, that it was okay, except Christians. And I don't mean fake Christians who tried to use the Bible as an excuse for slavery. I'm talking about the abolitionists who wanted to outlaw slavery. I'm talking about the people that got the 13th Amendment passed. I'm talking about the people who ran the Underground Railroad, the real Christians who knew that slavery was morally wrong and went against the Bible. So if an atheist says, well, I would turn in the slave, well, now he's a racist. He's a racist. He's obviously agrees with slavery, that it's okay to turn in black people over to their slave masters because, slavery's okay. And that is a moral travesty is what that is. It's a moral travesty. And how is he going to explain himself to people around him? So would he return the runaway slave? Or would he approve of rape? You see, this is the real weakness of atheism. The real weakness of atheism is the fact that they have no moral absolutes. And if you don't believe in God, then you don't believe in absolute truth. See, God says, I am the Lord, I change not. So God's word doesn't change because God is perfect. If God changed, he'd either change for the better or for the worse. If he changed for the worse, it means he's no longer perfect. If he changed for the better, it means he never was. So if God does not change and his word does not change, then the truth does not change. The truth remains as steady and steadfast as God because it is absolute moral truth and it is perfect as it is. And you can see that absolute moral truth reflected in Scripture. If we choose to live by the absolute moral truths of the Bible, then our nation will prosper. Our nation will be at peace. I mean, after all, love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's the key to world peace right there, folks. That is the key to world peace. But the atheist has to borrow that from Christianity if he's going to have that morality. If he's going to say, I believe you should love your neighbor as you love yourself, why? Why would you believe that? Where is your moral authority for that? You see, my moral authority is God. It's above me, above man. So if I'm believing that you're doing something wrong, I can base it off the moral authority of God. And I don't have to constrain myself to the opinions of men. But the atheist does. And that's the real weakness of atheism. And here in just a moment, we're going to talk about evolution, about how evolution is not true. I used to be an evolutionist when I was an atheist. Most of the time, I wouldn't recommend that you get involved in an argument with an atheist about evolution. But we're going to go into that in the next segment because I want you to have some background knowledge on that because that's basically what they believe their book of Genesis is. That's secular humanism is the religion of the atheist. Socialism is the politics of the atheist. Bernie Sanders, the famous socialist who ran against Hillary Clinton, is an atheist. He's absolutely an atheist. Hillary Clinton is an atheist too. She just doesn't admit it. I firmly believe she is actually an atheist. She's not a real Christian. Real Christians don't believe in abortion. They don't believe in gay marriage. They believe in the absolute moral truths as taught according to Scripture. That is real Christianity. But if you truly believe that you're going to be judged by a righteous and holy God, you would not support those things. The atheist does, because he just goes with the flow, because his morality changes with the ever-changing political tides and social changes. All right, folks, that's the music playing. That means it's time for a break. This is Pastor Dave Grisham with Last Frontier Evangelism Radio. You can contact me at lastfrontierevangelism@gmail.com. Send me love letters, hate mail, death threats, whatever you want to send me, but send it to that. Hang on, we'll be right back after this break. Good morning, Alaska. This is Pastor Dave Grisham with Last Frontier Evangelism Radio. Back from the break for our last segment of this week's show. Folks, you can contact me at lastfrontierevangelism@gmail.com if you want to put a comment out for this radio program, or if you have some suggestions, and try to keep them PG if you don't mind on the suggestions. And so, anyway, we're talking about atheism today. And I think atheism is one of the most dangerous types of philosophies in America today, because it will eventually lead to socialism, which will eventually lead to the eroding or taking away of your freedoms. It will lead to tyranny. So anyway, one of the things I talked about in the last segment was, I promised you as Christians, for those of you that are getting ready for church this morning, and I told you a little bit about how to witness to an atheist, talk about morality. But if you want to talk to an atheist about evolution, I'll just give you a few tips here in this last segment on how to do that. And evolution is not difficult to disprove. It's really not, because it's not really science. It's philosophy. And why do I say that? Well, very simply, because the very elementary definition of science is the study of the natural world through observation and experimentation. That's the most basic definition of science there is. Now, remember, I used to be an atheist, and I used to be an evolutionist. I have read Darwin's books. I've read lots of other books on evolution. I know the theory. And basically, the theory is that, things progress from a simpler form to a more complicated form. Now, we don't want to get into all the details of how the flaws in that, but basically, evolution is faith. Evolution is faith. Now, why would I say that? Well, because evolution is something you cannot see. You cannot observe it in nature, nor can you demonstrate it in a laboratory. Now, the evolutionist, the atheist, is going to say, well, yeah, I can take two fish and I can breed them and get a different kind of fish, and that proves evolution. No, that proves adaptation within a species. That does not prove macroevolution. That does not prove that one kind of animal can evolve into another kind. If you take bacteria and have them interbreed, they become other types of bacteria. They don't ever become a multi-celled organism. If you take two different kinds of cats and breed them, you get a different kind of cat. You don't get a dog. Okay? You don't get a different kind of animal by interbreeding these different animals and getting different mutations. It doesn't happen. No one has ever observed that in nature, nor has anyone ever demonstrated that in a laboratory. That's why I say that evolution is philosophy. It's not really science. It is the book of Genesis for the atheist, is really what it is. And if you look at atheism in general, actually the universities are their churches. The professors are their high priests, and their science books are their Bibles, and the theory of evolution is their book of Genesis. And I'm telling you, it's very, very easy to shoot holes in it, because you can't prove evolution. If an atheist says, prove to me there is a God, say, well, because he'll say, bring God down here and have him reveal himself to me, and I'll believe there is a God. Well, I'll tell him out on the streets, well, you bring an ape over here and have him evolve into a man in front of me, and I'll believe in evolution. And they usually say, well, that takes millions of years. Aha! That's called faith. You see, that's something you can't see. You can't see millions of years into the past, right? I mean, you can look at fossils, but fossils only tell you what died. that something lived and something died. It doesn't tell you how it lived. It doesn't tell you, if it evolved or not. All it tells you is something was living and something died. That's all a fossil ever tells you. Now, so if you run across an atheist and he asks you to prove God, ask him to prove evolution. Ask him to make it happen in front of you. Ask him to do it in a laboratory where you can see a cat evolve into a dog, or you can see an ape evolve into a man, and then you'll believe it. Of course, they won't be able to do it. And of course, the point you're going to try to make with this is not necessarily trying to lead them directly to Christ. What you're trying to do is lead them away from atheism. You're trying to put chinks in their armor. You're trying to make cracks in their arguments. You're trying to breach holes in their walls that they've erected around them to protect themselves from a belief in God. And once you've got them believing that atheism is probably not true, then they'll start believing in God. Then they might get led to Christ. So they cannot observe, or we cannot observe, and we cannot show in a laboratory evolution. It's not possible from one kind of animal into another kind. So they can't really prove it. But now you can look at things in the world and you can show strong evidence that evolution is not true, because you can shoot holes in the theory all day long. And I'll give you one right now. I wrote this little article. It's a very short article for Facebook, for a Facebook note. It's called "Viruses Prove Evolution Wrong." Very simply. And I write this. That title might sound like a bold statement, but it is true. All right, follow me on this. There are two basic things that must happen for evolution to be true. Number one, mutation. There must be some type of mutation in an organism for evolutionary change to take place. No mutation, no evolution. Viruses do mutate, so that one requirement is met. Number two, replication. The mutation must be passed on to successive generations for evolution to take place. Viruses do replicate, but how they replicate flies in the face of evolution. Viruses are supposedly the most ancient of all life forms, and they are the most simple. Evolution claims that all life starts out as more simple and becomes more complex through gradual evolutionary changes over long periods of time. So viruses are very ancient, or so evolution claims. But there's a serious issue with that. Viruses require a more advanced host to replicate. This means that if viruses predated their host, they could not replicate. No host, no replication. Viruses have a symbiotic relationship with their more advanced host, so they had to have been created together and could not have evolved separately. Otherwise, viruses would not exist today. And that's true. You see, viruses, they have to attach themselves to a more advanced host to inject their DNA into that host to replicate more viruses. That's the only way a virus can reproduce, is it has to have a more advanced host. Well, if a virus evolved and came about and said, "Oh, looky here, I'm a little virus. I just evolved. I'm one of the most primitive forms of life. And look, there's no more advanced host around me for me to replicate with. Oh my goodness, I died and I'm over." You see, it just can't work. And now there's other ways you can disprove evolution. For instance, you got about 24 different chemical reactions that have to take place in your body for your blood to clot. If you lose one of these little processes, these chemical processes, if you lose one, you become a hemophiliac. Well, how in the world do you get all of the 24 of these, or more than 24, I think there's more than 24, of these chemical reactions to take place in exactly the right order, like a combination lock? How do they evolve all at the same time? That's called irreducible complexity, is what that's called. That is a process called irreducible complexity. In other words, if you take one item out, the whole thing doesn't work. But how do they evolve all these things at once? How can a complicated machine evolve all at once in order for it to work? And your blood clotting is a complicated machine. Now, I could go on and on and on with organic biology because I took biology in college. I can go on and on and on telling you there's lots of different processes like that inside the cells with all kinds of other things. Folks, evolution is wrong. It is not even compatible with creation because God created the birds on the 5th day and he created the 4-footed creatures on the 6th day, according to the book of Genesis. So you can't even say God used evolution to create life. He did not. Evolution is a lie, and there's lots of ways to shoot holes in it. Anyway, I hope that's been informative for you today. And this is Pastor Dave Grisham with Last Frontier Evangelism Radio, and we'll be back next week between 8 and 9 a.m. on Sunday mornings. You can contact me at lastfrontierevangelism@gmail.com if you have questions or comments. Anyway, I will see you guys again next week. We'll be back.